Hello, this is King Rex with you. I'm making a reaction video to Mr. Beats' Every President's Biggest Accomplishments. I'm mainly gonna, I'm not gonna comment until the end of most of these, because he goes through all the presidents from Washington right through Biden. I mean, there's a little bit of an intro that I skipped ahead, but I do want to at least do the explanation.
Remember what this video is all about, Precious, don't you? It's about the biggest accomplishment of every American president while they were in office. But what does biggest accomplishment mean? Well, it basically just means the one thing they did while they were in office that had the greatest positive impact on the greatest number of people.
I like that standard. So I'll say right off the bat, he gives a great standard to start with.
When I say, quote, greatest positive impact on the greatest number of people, I say it with my historian hat on, looking at all of American history. Now, it has to be something they accomplished while in office, so sorry, William Henry Harrison. Jeez, what am I going to say for William Henry Harrison? Bruh.
Oh, yeah?
Ah!
What are you going to say about Andrew Johnson?
Oh, hey, Mr. Terry.
I've actually watched the video. I watched Vlogging Through History's review of it. Most of the stuff this guy says doesn't make sense, but Andrew Johnson did have some positive accomplishments. There's presidents I could say, what are you going to say about that are worse than Andrew Johnson? But I'll let you know when those ones come along.
What was that?
Oh, hey, Mr. Beat. Sorry, I thought you knew I was watching you. So what are you going to say about Andrew Johnson?
Oh, geez. What am I going to say for Andrew Johnson? Well, you'll all just have to find out, okay? Well, feel free to jump in if you disagree with me on any of these, okay?
Are you sure? I kind of feel bad for interrupting you already.
Oh, don't feel bad. I only peed my pants a little bit. Seriously, though, my audience would love to hear your expertise on this. So, right, audience? Eh?
Right on. Let's do this.
Here is the biggest accomplishment for every American president in history while they were in office, in my opinion.
And in my opinion, too.
Yes, of course, in our opinion. Curtain, please. Curtain. George Washington. The greatest accomplishment of Washington was making it clear what the role of the president was. Sure, the U.S. Constitution laid it all out, but you know how people can interpret that differently and stuff. Washington made it clear that he, as president, was not only the head of state, but also the commander-in-chief in charge of all the armed forces. Not just the armed forces, in fact. He was also in charge of all of the executive branch. Additionally, while he couldn't pass new laws, he certainly influenced Congress into passing new laws, as well as vetoing two he didn't like. Washington also made sure the president, as head of state, was the lead spokesperson for the entire country. Even more specifically, though, the greatest thing that he did while in office was quit. Yeah.
Washington's biggest accomplishment was making the Constitution work. While quitting in office was a great act, making the Constitution work and outlining what the presidency was his greatest accomplishment.
He made it clear that he didn't want to be a king, and he voluntarily resigned or retired at the end of his second term, and thus set a standard for all future American presidents who came after him. John Adams. Although there's a strong case to make that appointing John Marshall to the Supreme Court was the most impactful positive thing Adams did while president, I'm actually going to go with the Convention of 1800 instead, which ended the quasi-war and healed relations between the United States and France.
The only issue with this is that John Adams did a whole lot to make those relations strained to begin with. He basically fixed what he put wrong to begin with. And really it was Napoleon, when he took over France, deciding that the war with the United States really just wasn't worth it.
In fact, without John Adams' biggest accomplishment, Thomas Jefferson's biggest accomplishment wouldn't even exist. Thomas Jefferson. You probably already guessed this one, but Jefferson's biggest accomplishment was the Louisiana Purchase. As unconstitutional as it maybe was for
The Louisiana Purchase was not unconstitutional. Even James Madison, who was the chief author of the Constitution, said that it wasn't unconstitutional.
just $15 million, Jefferson was able to nearly double the size of the country and dramatically increased the country's power over the continent. While it had a positive impact long term for many Americans, it is also important to recognize that it came at a great cost for tens of thousands of Native Americans.
The fact is that eventually the Native Americans probably would have been squeezed out in one way or another. Instead of it being the United States holding control over that land, it would have probably been other countries. Mexico would have ended up with that. Maybe some new country would have been formed. So they would have probably went through a lot of the bad things that they did anyways. Also, it should be noted that the Lewis and Clark expedition gave claim to Oregon country. So a lot of that is because of Jefferson, too. I think Jefferson deserves more credit for Oregon country than, say, James Polk.
James Madison. Madison's significance to the United States is much greater as a founding father, but as president, he honestly didn't have that many accomplishments.
This is a real big sticking point I have with a lot of historians like Mr. B. Madison did quite a bit of good as president. We'll let him finish on Madison, though, and then I'll go over some of the things.
Still holding Great Britain back during the War of 1812 easily is his biggest accomplishment, in my opinion. The Americans were huge underdogs in that war, and surviving the British threat indeed felt like a second war of independence and led to sweeping patriotism and unity across the country.
Whoa. What about James Madison being the chief author of the Constitution?
Yeah, I think this guy's supposed to be here for comic relief. Either that or he didn't actually hear the first part that it's about things they did as president.
That's gotta be worth something.
Well, that was way before he was president.
Also, being the shortest president ever at 5'4", that's an accomplishment?
That's not really an accomplishment of any type. But in addition to the War of 1812, which Madison did get all of his war aims before going into the war. He stopped the British impressment of soldiers. He stopped the British incitement of Native Americans, which are doing Native Americans in what is now the Midwest. He got the British to evacuate forts on American territory, which they were supposed to do at the end of the Revolutionary War. And they actually demilitarized the Great Lakes for the most part. So there was a lot of accomplishments from the War of 1812. That Madison accomplished, but he had another really big accomplishment that nobody ever gives him credit for. The Second Barbary Pirates War pretty much put an end to the Barbary pirates. Got rid of piracy in that area of the world, and not only that, he forced the Barbary pirates to release all the people they had captured from Europe, which they were basically holding mostly as slaves. So he deserves a lot of credit for that too. So those two are two huge accomplishments. So to say he wasn't a very accomplished president, it is just completely wrong.
Yeah, he was short. James Monroe. Well, Monroe did sign the Missouri Compromise, which held the country together despite its differences over slavery.
You could honestly argue that the Missouri Compromise caused harm as much as good, because not all these areas here were states where this line is shown. This is not a map of what the country looked like at the time that compromise was signed. I don't think Arkansas, first off, Texas wasn't even part of the United States at that time, so I don't know where he gets this map from. Neither is a lot of the stuff out west, but again, this is probably supposed to, it ain't even a Civil War map, because I'm pretty sure Minnesota was already a state during the Civil War. So this is not an accurate map, but I'm pretty sure that Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas were not states yet. So basically what it did was, even though it was kind of already going that way, north-south with free and slave, it further cemented that north-south slavery, as the North is free, the South is slave. Plus, a lot of people in the South thought that this line pretty much extended the whole way around the world with the Missouri Compromise, which there was a lot of fights of making California, the southern part, a slave state because of that. So it did have some negative impact
for the next 30 years, but I think Monroe's biggest accomplishment was no law he signed, but just a bunch of words he said. The Monroe Doctrine, baby! The Monroe Doctrine was...
I don't know why he mispronounces Monroe. He's actually not a history teacher. He's an economics teacher, but he doesn't even teach anymore. He said that in one of his videos, but he should not say Monroe. I agree the Monroe Doctrine was big. The other thing you could say from it was really big was that he actually got the agreement to take over Florida. So he basically annexed Florida, so that should be considered big too. And Florida at that time included the southern, if you run a line straight across the top of Florida, which we could do with this video here. This part, if you run this line straight across, they actually had the bottom part of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, except where the Mississippi River. So it was more than just Florida that he got in that agreement.
Accomplishment was no law he signed, but just a bunch of words he said. The Monroe Doctrine, baby! The Monroe Doctrine was basically a set of foreign policy principles that said that any intervention in the political affairs of the Americas for foreign powers, okay, mostly Europe, would be seen as a hostile act. In other words, you mess with me and my neighbors to the south, we will come after you, my friend. Most historians say the Monroe Doctrine is a defining moment in the history of American foreign policy, and it would heavily influence the foreign policy of many presidents who came after him.
In fact, I think even Kennedy cited the Monroe Doctrine during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it did influence a lot. There were some presidents that kind of perverted the meaning of it.
So his greatest achievement is intimidating foreign countries. How American?
How?
I guess you can put it that way, but literally what he did was he helped the countries south of the United States set up independent governments.
How American indeed. John Quincy Adams. Infrastructure, FTW. Adams was greatly influential through his ambitious infrastructure projects to keep the country connected, in particular presiding over big repairs and further construction on the national road and the creation of a bunch of new canals. Andrew Jackson. Jackson is the only president in American history to pay off the national debt.
He did pay it off for a short time, but there was a small debt when he left office, and he put a lot of programs in place, and a lot of things that happened that caused more debt to pile up during his term in office. Basically, he started the Second Seminole War, which was very expensive. He crashed the economy, and he destroyed the second bank in the United States. So those things, plus he lowered tariffs, which meant less money coming into the coffer. So he did do some things that hurt the national debt as well.
When he first took office, the national debt was...
I also don't think these numbers are quite right here, because I know that the debt was going down long before he became president. Like between James Monroe, and John Quincy Adams both reduced the debt almost as much in their terms in office as Jackson did in his term.
$58 million. 6 years later, he was able to limit the spending of Congress so much that it was down to zero, and there was a surplus. So what did Jackson do with all the extra money that came in? Well, he divided it evenly between the states, of course. Martin Van Buren. Van Buren helped in the Aroostook War between settlers of Maine and New Brunswick.
This is actually kind of true. There was no actual war, first off, but he did kind of settle things down a little bit, but he also kicked the can down the road on that issue. He did on that issue, the Carolina Affair and Texas annexation. He kicked the can down the road on all three of those. So he really didn't have much of an accomplishment there, but he's one of the three presidents, I'll say, that I really can't find a major positive accomplishment during their term. So I guess I could see why this would be chosen, even though really he didn't fix the issue. He just kind of kicked the can down the road.
Bet you didn't know that, did you? Huh?
And those mutton chops.
William Henry Harrison. Oh, geez. Here it is. Well, his biggest accomplishment as president for those 31 days was his great inauguration speech, the one in which he famously wore no coat and spoke longer than any other president at their inauguration in history. Oh, I know! Appointing Daniel Webster as Secretary of State. That was an excellent choice.
I would agree with the Daniel Webster appointment as being his biggest accomplishment. Remember, all he really got the chance to do was to pick his cabinet. He didn't really get much of a chance to do anything else as president because he died I think it's either 30 or 31 days later. I think it was 31 days after taking office. But Daniel Webster actually negotiated the Webster-Ashburton Treaty, which settled the Aroostook War and the Caroline Affair with Britain. So he had much of the border with Canada that was west of Minnesota.
Woo! John Tyler. I would say Tyler's biggest accomplishment was the annexation of Texas. He was a big reason why Texas joined the United States. And remember, it was an independent country at the time it did so. A shout out to Tyler, Texas, by the way.
I do agree annexing Texas was his biggest accomplishment, but it was under him that Webster-Ashburton Treaty was negotiated because he kept Daniel Webster as his Secretary of State for most of his presidency.
A city named to honor him, James Polk. While I don't entirely approve of how he did it, overall Polk's biggest accomplishment was acquiring more territory for the United States than any other president.
Okay, I want to point this out. Texas here, this pink part was all John Tyler. And Oregon Territory was pretty much done by Jefferson. There was a small disputed area, but at the end of Tyler's presidency, there was a proposal put on the table by Edward Everett, who was his minister to Britain, which was pretty much how it ended up dividing. In fact, the only part of the area that Britain didn't agree with going on to 49th parallel was the fact that Vancouver Island goes below that, part of it does, and they wanted all of that. And they also had a claim to the part of Washington state that is south and west of the Columbia River. So he didn't annex all of this. Well, obviously he didn't do the Louisiana Territory, but Oregon Territory and Texas he didn't do. But he does deserve the accomplishment for the Mexican cession, which is California, Nevada, Utah, small part of Colorado, most of Arizona, and maybe half of New Mexico, because a lot of New Mexico is west of this line. This is the Rio Grande River.
In history, kind of a big deal. First, through carrying out the annexation of Texas. Next, through aggressively getting the United States involved in a war with Mexico that got the country all of this out here. And finally, negotiating a treaty with Great Britain to secure Oregon Territory.
Well, as I said earlier, you can see that this was the disputed area that they were concerned over. But Britain basically didn't want to cut the southern part of Vancouver Island, and it needed a way to get through the channel there. So that's basically, and actually the proposal by Edward Everett is what was eventually accepted. Had Polk lost the election, it would have went through anyway. There would have been no Mexican-American War probably to acquire California, but the rest of it would have happened anyway.
Sea to shining sea indeed.
Polk was also the subject of They Might Be Giants' most underappreciated song.
Well, I mean, I wrote a song about Polk too, you know. I wrote a song about all the presidents. Zachary Taylor. I would argue that Taylor's biggest accomplishment was making sure California would be admitted to the Union as a free state. Although he was a slave owner himself, he was against the expansion of slavery out west. And as more and more Southerners threatened to leave the Union over the issue of slavery, he increasingly sided with the anti-slavery Northerners during his presidency. Because of him, California skipped over becoming a federal territory because he knew otherwise Congress would just endlessly fight about whether or not slavery should be legal there.
He's actually wrong on that. California became a state because of the actions, a free state immediately rather than become a territory because of the actions of Millard Fillmore as part of the Compromise of 1850. California was not a state at any point in time under Zachary Taylor's term in office. Now, he supported that as president, but he didn't accomplish it. He basically sided with the North on the fact that states should not be allowed to secede from the Union. So he wasn't really siding with the North on that. He was just siding with basically not allowing people to secede from the Union. So, although he was not for the extension of slavery, even though he was a slave owner president, in fact, he was the first president to flatly come out against the extension of slavery. Really, the only president before Lincoln that was 100% against it. Fillmore really wasn't for it either, but he was more pragmatic in his political considerations. His greatest accomplishment to me would be the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty with Great Britain, because it did make for better relations with Great Britain. There was a possibility of a rivalry over Central America and the Caribbean between the United States and Great Britain forming, and it kind of stopped that from happening. So that was his greatest accomplishment as president.
Millard Fillmore. Fillmore and his Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, organized and sent out the Perry Expedition, which opened relations between Japan and the outside world.
It should be noted that Daniel Webster was Secretary of State under 3 presidents. I don't think anybody else has ever done that, because he was under William Henry Harrison for a large portion of John Tyler's term. And everyone in, I think all of Taylor's cabinet just immediately resigned when Fillmore became president, which makes little to no sense. So he made Daniel Webster his Secretary of State. But then Edward Everett, who I already mentioned, replaces Daniel Webster because Daniel Webster ends up dying while Fillmore's president. I disagree with the Perry Expedition. And I do believe it was an accomplishment. He had a lot of accomplishments. My number one would be the Compromise of 1850 because it actually did end the Civil War at that point. He also stopped South Carolina from seceding, which they were planning to do as president. And he kept Hawaii from being taken over by the French while president as well. So he had some accomplishments. This was one of them. But I would say the Compromise of 1850 because it made California a free state. It gave the part of Texas the part of New Mexico that was east of the Rio Grande River, and part of the New Mexico territory, which meant slavery would not exist there. Although it did allow the territory to decide, there was no slaves in the territory at the time. It was so poorly suited to slavery that it would never take hold. It did make it available in the Utah territory, but the Utah territory was held by Mormons, and Mormons didn't have slaves, so pretty much there would be no slavery there either. It also got rid of the slave trade in Washington, D.C., so people would not be selling slaves in Washington, D.C., which had been legal up until that point. It did have the Fugitive Slave Act, but all that really did, it's generally overblown. Basically, the first Fugitive Slave Act that was passed, and it is in the Constitution that they have to be returned, said that the states where they were caught were responsible for returning them. A lot of states were basically breaking that law. So, I mean, if you believe that, basically they were nullified. So if you're against nullification at one point, I know that there's the moral argument. I'm not saying slavery is good, but at the time, it was seen as a constitutional issue, not a moral issue. He just made federal marshals responsible for returning the freed slaves rather than the states themselves where they were being caught. So really, it didn't make, and it actually wasn't that well enforced when he was president anyway. A lot of people in the South were unhappy with what they saw as lax enforcement of the law. even after he passed the new fugitive slave law. He didn't think that they were enforcing it properly. So neither side was happy with that.
The expedition ultimately led to an end to Japan's 220-year-old policy of isolation. Not only did it lead to diplomatic relations between Japan and the United States, but it also led to diplomatic relations with Japan and most of Europe.
Some people try to blame that for making Japan a militaristic country, which is ridiculous. Opening trade relations does not mean you're going to become militaristic. If you're going to blame that on anyone, Theodore Roosevelt taking Japan's side and handing them basically South Korea, which was an independent country before that, and the Russo-Japanese treaty, the treaty that solved that, I think it's called the Treaty of Portsmouth, and siding with them over Russia really had more to do with Japan becoming the type of imperial Japan they were. Plus, Woodrow Wilson slighted Japan, and so did the other allies at the Paris Conference, which negotiated all the treaties. Those two actions did a lot more to make Imperial Japan the militaristic country that it was leading up to World War II than anything Millard Fillmore did.
Franklin Pierce. How about the Gadsden Purchase?
Why haven't you done any jokes about the Gadsden Purchase?
Pierce arranged for it to be bought from Mexico for a fairly cheap price, and it provided a great strip of land to build a transcontinental railroad.
I agree, it's his greatest accomplishment. Honestly, we were supposed to he originally negotiated an even bigger area that Congress balked at, and they cut the area down and cut the amount of money down that was negotiated. I think it was supposed to be at least 50% more land than what it was. But I'd say it was his greatest accomplishment because he got this land peacefully. Like, Polk basically forced Mexico to take an agreement that they didn't want. He was able to peacefully negotiate this. And he wasn't a terrible president outside of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But that was so bad, that's why he's bad. But this was easily his best accomplishment. Otherwise, he would have been a solid president, but signing the Kansas-Nebraska law just totally ruined his presidency.
While also resolving border disputes that had been ongoing.
You gotta be able to laugh at the Gadsden Purchase. I mean, it's what life's all about. Maybe that's...
I really don't understand how these jokes are funny. I mean, if this is the best you can get on these nighttime talk shows, it's getting pretty bad. Although at least it's not them trying to pile on to current politics constantly.
That's what your life's about, but I don't see what's so funny about a 150-year-old land treaty.
Well, just look at all the comedic possibilities. I mean, you got Franklin Pierce, hello, James Gadsden, not to mention topographical issues regarding the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. I mean, the jokes practically write themselves.
Today, 1.8 million Americans live in that area, and it remains an important part of the country. Although I must give a shout out to Pierce for aggressively lowering tariffs.
The tariff he lowered, this is one of the issues with Mr. B. He just is low tariff good, high tariff bad type of attitude towards tariffs. Tariffs are one of the things in a president's toolbox that they can do. And there were a lot of presidents that raised and lowered tariffs, but the tariff of 1857 was one of the things that helped set off the Panic of 1857, which was an economic depression that lasted the entire way through James Buchanan's term. They put tariffs too low at that point, and it hurt a lot of industry. Because remember, low tariffs helped the southern plantation owners because they could get the expensive foreign goods that they bought with all the money they made off of slavery cheaper. Plus, sometimes it helped them open markets to sell their cotton and tobacco. And in the North, it hurt the workers and the factory owners because they had to compete more with those, and sometimes they couldn't compete. So the idea that lowering tariffs is always good is really, it's not looking at it historically, which if you look at it historically, he lowered tariffs, and boy, the economy went to the ruts, right? Granted, it wasn't the only thing. The decision in the Dred Scott case hurt because it stopped a lot of westward expansion, because a lot of people just didn't want to go out there if it was going to be slavery everywhere. And also, Buchanan did some things monetarily that made it worse too.
And thus lowering the cost of doing business and making stuff cheaper for consumers.
Basically, tariffs are a tax. If you take tariffs away and replace them with another tax, you're still making it expensive for people. So it's not that great.
James Buchanan. There weren't many accomplishments, but I think Buchanan's biggest was establishing more federal control over Utah territory in what became known as the Utah War. I still think Brigham Young was the worst governor in American history, and it was ultimately a good thing that Buchanan got him out of there.
I disagree. The Utah War was bad. Basically, there were conflicting reports. Some of them were very sensational, saying they were doing all kinds of crazy things out there that really weren't happening, and he nearly started basically, he was putting down what he thought was a rebellion in Utah, something that he was unwilling to do when states started seceding from the Union in the South. The Utah War, his handling of that was really a negative mark. I don't think I'd go so far as to say Brigham Young was the worst governor ever. Mario Cuomo basically locked people with COVID inside of nursing homes, causing the deaths of lots of American citizens by allowing the disease to spread among the people that were most vulnerable. That's pretty bad. Plus, I would even say some of these governors that actually did secede from the United States because they wanted to keep their slaves, wouldn't they be considered worse than Brigham Young? So I'd say there's far worse governors than Brigham Young in the history of the United States. Also, a lot of these pro-segregation governors, I mean, like the one in charge of 1957 in Little Rock, he was pretty awful. Believe it or not, George Wallace, as bad as he was one of the better governors from the South at the time, because at least he tried to make the separate facilities as equal as he possibly could because he wanted to keep segregation. The other ones never even tried to make stuff equal. So there was far worse governors in this than Brigham Young. I mean, it's not even close. Most people that hate Brigham Young hate him because they hate Mormons. I'm not saying Mr. Beat does. He probably doesn't. But he's probably read a lot of history from the perspective of people that feel that way. It's kind of like the Lost Cause history, except it's anti-Mormon history. And I'm not Mormon. I'm Catholic, so it's nothing like that. But I think everyone should have religious freedom. And basically, they went out to Utah to be left alone because they were pushed around. In fact, the governor of Missouri that pushed them out there, that did the extermination order, I think his name might have been Boggs, he was worse than Brigham Young.
And Buchanan was the only president not to be married. That's got to be an accomplishment, right?
If he was a really good-looking man that women would be throwing themselves at, it would be an accomplishment, but no one would accuse Buchanan of that.
That's definitely an accomplishment. I love Mrs. Beat. Abraham Lincoln. Keeping the country together? Hello? In addition to preserving the Union with his leadership during the Civil War, I'd say Lincoln's biggest accomplishment was ending slavery. First, with his Emancipation Proclamation, and second, with everything he was able to do behind the scenes to get the 13th Amendment passed.
Two major accomplishments, but I would actually say that the bigger of the two is keeping the Union together, because without the United States, do you have that counterweight against Nazi Germany and against Soviet Russia? I would say no. So I would say his biggest accomplishment literally is saving the Union, although ending slavery would be the biggest accomplishment for most presidents if someone else had it. So, two great accomplishments for Lincoln. That's why most people do put him first overall. I put Washington first overall, but I understand it completely. My issue with Lincoln is that he did go a bit far. I think he was right to suspend habeas corpus, but I think he went a bit far in some cases with how he used that suspension.
as seen in the wonderful film named The 13th Amendment. Lincoln.
Hey, Lincoln also accomplished being the tallest president at 6'4", without the hat even. Oh, and he's in the Wrestling Hall of Fame.
Fun facts. Andrew Johnson. Again, not many accomplishments during Johnson's presidency either. But I suppose give him credit for the purchase of Alaska from Russia. In my opinion, it was another great bargain that benefited the United States long term.
Andrew Johnson had one really horrible thing he did by being defiant towards Reconstruction. He actually had, not only did he buy Alaska, which was great, he also, which I would put number one, so I do agree with his choice. He stopped he got Maximilian out of Mexico, which reinforced the Monroe Doctrine. That was great. He's also a pretty good president economically, too. So, I mean, if he would have not been racist and basically emboldening the South during Reconstruction to be defiant of it, he would actually have been a solid president. Kind of like Pierce, one massively bad thing he did kind of ruins the rest of it, but he at least had some positive accomplishments.
Ulysses Grant. Grant actually had quite a bit of accomplishments while he was president, but I say his efforts to help African Americans remain at the top. His push for the passing of the 15th Amendment, his signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1875, and his success hunting down and prosecuting members of the KKK during Reconstruction make him one of the strongest allies of African Americans during the 1800s.
I'd say you could argue he was the strongest ally of African Americans of any president ever. I would put basically his work trying to secure rights for African Americans as his number one biggest accomplishment, but he was a president that did a lot of things that were great for the economy long term as well. And he did fight corruption, even though there was some corrupt people he appointed. He actually rooted out a lot of corruption that they blamed him for that he didn't have nothing to do with. And he did appoint the first Civil Service Commission. So the start towards civil service reform actually does start under Grant.
Rutherford Hayes. Hayes' biggest accomplishment was getting the ball rolling with civil service reform. Instead of giving federal jobs to his political supporters, he had a policy of giving them jobs based on whether or not they were, wait for it now, qualified. And when Congress was slow to act on civil service reform, Hayes issued an executive order that prohibited federal office holders from having to make campaign contributions or being politically active in order to work in the federal government.
I actually have to disagree with that for the simple fact that he didn't start civil service reform. Grant did. His biggest accomplishment, there's one thing called the Bill of Riders, where the Democrats took control of Congress and they were trying to force riders onto a legislation that would have gotten rid of all the enforcement acts that Grant used to crush the Ku Klux Klan. He vetoed all those bills. He won that part of it, that they stayed on the books. But unfortunately, he didn't do very much himself to actually enforce those laws. He also ended the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. He did so not by just taking either side and crushing things out. He just kept it from being any major riots. So I think his handling of that was pretty good too. And he was actually a pretty good president economically.
James Garfield. He was only in office for a few months, but still, he took what Hayes did with civil service reform and cranked it up to 11. Even though it became a law after his assassination, I'd argue the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act was mostly because of him.
There's some truth here, some stuff that's skewed a bit. The biggest accomplishment he had is he did rework the national debt to save the taxpayers money. It was really the only real accomplishment he had as president. It is true that the act was in response to Garfield being assassinated and dying. So it probably wouldn't have happened had he not been assassinated, but you still can't consider him getting assassinated an accomplishment. That's an accomplishment of Chester Arthur, not James Garfield. Now, could he have been a really good president? Most people who kind of know presidents and know him said he they think he probably would have been. But really, kind of like William Henry Harrison, he just really didn't have much time to get anything accomplished. But he did rework the debt to save money.
Chester Arthur. Arthur is a big reason why the United States Navy became a lot stronger. Since the Civil War, American naval power had dramatically declined. But Arthur almost single-handedly reversed that trend.
He did start modernizing the Navy, but it wasn't single-handedly. There's another president that did more for it that we'll be getting to. He's the one who the biggest accomplishment was the Pendleton Civil Service Act. It passed under him, and it worked properly because of a lot of things he did, including the people that he put in to enforce it, the people he put on the Civil Service Commission, stuff like that. So he not only helped get it passed and signed it, he actually made that act work. So that's Arthur's accomplishment. That's his biggest accomplishment.
Grover Cleveland. I think Cleveland's biggest accomplishment was related to not what he did do, but what he didn't do. He weakened the power of the presidency.
This is actually false. He did not weaken the power of the presidency. He actually probably increased it. He used the veto as basically a default on all bills. He vetoed all kinds of stuff, which was adding more power to the presidency. As Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces, he sent them several times into the Caribbean in instances where the United States interests weren't involved, like getting into a border dispute with Venezuela and British New Guinea. He sent them down to crush a rebellion in Panama and things like that. So he did a lot of stuff in that manner that expanded the power of the presidency. He made the Bureau of Agriculture a cabinet-level position, which expanded the power of the presidency. He created the Bureau of Labor. I think it was Labor. Once again, expanded the power of the presidency. The Interstate Commerce Commission expanded the power of the executive office because they get to pick the people on that commission. So he expanded the power of the presidency. He didn't shrink it down. He's seen as being someone that was small government because of some of the things he said, but those things were said because he didn't like Civil War pensions, because the pensions only went to Northerners that fought for the Union. They didn't go to Southerners that fought against the Union and the Confederacy. He didn't think that that was fair. But yeah, he was not a small government guy. He just used the small government argument when it fit what he was wanting to do.
I think that's a good thing. Time and time again throughout his presidency, when many called for him to act, he essentially responded by saying the Constitution didn't allow him to do so. As Commander-in-Chief, when imperialists wanted him to take over Hawaii,
Hawaii itself actually submitted a treaty to be annexed, and the thing is, they got annexed under the next president anyway, with McKinley, because they still wanted to be annexed, and there was never a call for him to take over Cuba, which is the next thing he says. Since I stopped him, I'm also going to say it beforehand and not stop him again.
and Cuba, he resisted. I think this constraint is noble, and you just don't see it with very many American presidents.
Even if he thinks that the restraint was noble, it didn't have a long-lasting impact, because nothing he did, other than the Interstate Commerce Commission, which I consider a negative thing, had a long-lasting impact. In fact, he is the third president that I really don't see any positive to what he did. I didn't see any major positive actions out of Grover Cleveland that were impactful.
Benjamin Harrison. Hands down, Harrison's biggest accomplishment was signing the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was the first big law to fight trusts, monopolies, and cartels in order to increase economic competitiveness.
This was the president that actually built the Navy up. I mean, there was a few still ships built by Arthur, but he made the modern U.S. Navy. It was expanded a little bit after him, but he built the modern, at that time, of course, nothing then, but the United States did not have a modern Navy for years, and he built that modern Navy, building actual battleships, which the United States didn't even have before that point. He did have a lot of landmark legislation, not only that Sherman Antitrust Act, the Land Revision Act, which is basically what allowed it to be a national park system. There wasn't one national park in Yellowstone, but he made that act that made it for a lot more. He passed the Judiciary Act, which which created a Circuit Court of Appeals, U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, and helped remake the Supreme Court. So you can even argue that that act was bigger. So he had a lot of really big things he did. So maybe even just that judicial act that no one even thinks of might be the biggest one. He's really very underrated president.
William McKinley. Many don't realize this, but McKinley set the stage for the Panama Canal existing. He was very hands-on in the planning process, even though it wouldn't be completed until 13 years after his death.
It is true that McKinley probably deserves at least half that credit for the canal. I'd say half to McKinley, and I mean, you can't even say that much, but between McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt, they should divide credit about equally. I would say annexing Hawaii and the Spanish-American War, because those are both long-term, because we have Puerto Rico and Guam because of the Spanish-American War. We annexed Hawaii. Those would be his biggest accomplishments. But the canal should also be considered as much McKinley as Teddy Roosevelt.
Theodore Roosevelt. There were so many big accomplishments during Teddy's presidency, but I'll go with his influence and signing of both the Federal Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act.
Believe it or not, the companies that were being regulated wanted these regulations, and they are good, because I do think you should know what's in what you're buying. But these would have probably happened anyway, because actually, believe it or not, the big companies wanted these. Because then they could, in order to be able to sell their products overseas, which the United States was starting to become more of a nation that was importing things out to other countries. Actually, the United States generally was more of an import nation. I actually was starting to become that. It wasn't so much before that. They needed to have those standards so that they could sell those products in Europe. So they wanted those standards to be there. Plus, the Meat Inspection Act actually helped the bigger meatpacking companies because they could afford the inspectors, whereas the smaller ones really couldn't. So it kind of was a thing that helped big business. I would say for Teddy Roosevelt, his biggest accomplishment really was the Panama Canal. That would be number one. As I said, 50-50 between him and McKinley. I'd probably say 50% Roosevelt, 40% McKinley, maybe 10% other presidents before that. The canal was eventually going to be built, but I think you have to give him credit for getting things done.
Together, those laws have been extremely influential, protecting us as consumers.
He rode a moose.
That he did. William Taft. While Roosevelt is known as the trust-buster president, Taft nearly doubled the number of antitrust lawsuits of Roosevelt. And
The thing with Taft is when he did it according to the laws written in constitutionally. Teddy Roosevelt prosecuted different companies based upon whether or not he felt that they were a good or bad company. To me, his biggest accomplishment is that he was far more constitutional than the president on either side of him, and Wilson and Teddy Roosevelt. He was mostly a constitutional president, although there's a few things I disagree with him on. But even when he wanted to make changes like income tax, direct election of senators, he went the constitutional route on those things.
he did that in just one term. Also, a shout out to his dollar diplomacy foreign policy, which sought to expand American influence overseas, not through military force, but through economic incentives.
He was so fat he got stuck in a bathtub.
Poor William Howard Taft, always with the memes with the bathtub.
Couple things here. Dollar diplomacy, while better than the gunboat diplomacy of Wilson and Teddy, still a bad policy. What it basically did was it entangled the United States and the internal affairs of these other countries through these investments, which would mean that you would probably have some the United States going in there militarily later on, which did actually happen. Plus, he was never actually stuck in a bathtub. I think that comes from the fact that he had a really large bathtub put in the White House that he would fit better than a normal size one because he was a big guy, but he never was stuck. But I think that's where the memes come from.
Woodrow Wilson. I'm a big fan of Wilson's 14 points, a list of principles he created to influence peace negotiations at the end of World War I. They promoted stuff like free trade, open agreements, democracy around the world, and something known as self-determination, which means people around the world ought to determine who rules over them. Basically, Wilson promoting self-determination was him strongly rejecting imperialism.
The 14 points are very misunderstood. A lot of things in the 14 points were put in those treaties, and they caused issues down the road. He was against Germany keeping their imperial colonies. Those imperial colonies just went to other countries. In the Pacific Ocean, the ones north of a certain line went to Japan. The ones south of there went to either Australia or New Zealand, and Japan thought they were going to get them all. So that caused friction and helped to lead to World War I. The ones in Africa went either to France or Britain. The Ottoman Empire was basically cut up into British and French colonies, except for what is today Turkey. Even parts of that were made. Turkey had to fight and take those off of other countries because some parts of what is modern day Turkey were given to other countries like Greece and Italy. So he didn't make the world safe for democracy. He made the world safe for British and French imperialism. The self-determination was kind of wishy-washy because all the Germans that were in Austria, that if it was self-determination should have went right back into Germany, didn't do that. And he was against them taking Austria. He was against them keeping Alsace and Lorraine, which was German people. But even in the 14 points, it says that has to go back to France. The Polish corridor was German people. A large portion of Czechoslovakia was German people. A lot of what led up to and caused World War I was in the 14 points. It also created Yugoslavia, which you see all the issues that Yugoslavia had after the Cold War ended. So the 14 points in Wilson's negotiating of the treaties in France helped lead to World War II. He even slighted the Japanese during the negotiations because they wanted a thing put in the UN, not the United Nations, the League of Nations Charter, where regardless of race you'd be treated equally. And he kept that from being put in there, so the Japanese didn't like that because it's basically making a line to if you're white, you're good. If you're not white, you're not good. You're not on the same tape. You're not at the same level. In fact, I think that the Japanese were held out of the main negotiations anyway, when Italy was given a spot. Plus remember that Wilson tipped the balance of World War I. And by tipping the balance of World War I, it allowed for the punitive treaties to be put on these other countries. Anyway, by breaking up the Austro-Hungarian Empire, it kind of put buffer states between Germany and Russia where they wouldn't have to worry about anyone there.
Even though some folks laughed at Wilson's 14 points at the time, calling them too, quote, idealistic, today they are mainstream ideals, which ultimately are a big reason why the United Nations exists.
All right. Real talk here. Woodrow Wilson's 14 points were a very good set of ideas. And if more of them had actually gone into the Treaty of Versailles, maybe no World War II.
Of all stuff the guy says, this is probably the thing that's the most nonsensical. A lot of the stuff in the 14 points helped push for World War II. Like, a lot of that. Making those easily dominatable and defeatable countries between Russia and Germany meant that they kind of had one side of one flank to their east they didn't have to worry about anymore. They only had to worry about France. A lot of the minimalization of the amount of troops you could have was in the 14 points. There's so many bad things in the 14 points. Plus, remember, Wilson not only gave Britain and France every reason to fight on with the House Gray Memorandum, he tipped the balance of power that allowed those treaties to be imposed. You can't just try to wash Wilson of the blame. His policies led to World War II. He's not 100% responsible, but he has a lot of responsibility there because he tipped the balance of power. He gave Britain and France a reason to fight on. He tipped the balance of power, and he negotiated those treaties. Plus, he went around the United States saying how great the Treaty of Versailles was, trying to get it passed by Congress, saying how it's the best thing ever. So you can't say Wilson had nothing to do with it.
Warren Harding. Harding signed the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921, which created the country's first formal budgeting process and put the president in charge of budget planning. I'm sorry, Harding, that was kind of boring for you.
Harding was actually a really good president. He actually got treaties with the United States negotiated with the former Central Powers, something Wilson couldn't do, even though the war had ended. Like, with 2 years left in his term in office or more. The economy was falling into a shambles because Wilson had overly high taxes, overly regulated the economy. He didn't demobilize after the war, so Harding got all that fixed. The country was running huge deficits at the time, but under Wilson, the federal debt went up 10 times. So for every dollar they owed when Wilson became president, he owed $10 by the time he left office. That's a lot. Harding ran a net surplus. He got the economy fixed. He actually passed an act that was a precursor to the highway bills under Eisenhower. He fought for civil rights for blacks. He did a lot of good things. I'd say basically cleaning up Wilson's mess. Fixing the economy is probably his biggest accomplishment. But he also had the Washington Naval Conference, which was the first weapons limitations treaty ever. So he deserves credit for that too.
Calvin Coolidge. I think Coolidge's biggest accomplishment was signing the Indian Citizenship Act, which recognized that any person born in the United States was a citizen. It was passed after, for years, courts had not recognized Native Americans as citizens and therefore not protected by the U.S. Constitution.
I don't think that's a bad act. Another thing Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, all three did, they reversed what you could term as the bad neighbor policy that had been going on under Taft, Teddy Roosevelt, and Wilson. They made what was the good neighbor policy as well. So I think those things are good.
Herbert Hoover. I just don't know. Hoover's not giving me much to work with, okay? I guess the 3 Supreme Court justices he nominated? Charles Evans Hughes, Owen Roberts, and Benjamin Cardozo.
Hughes was good. Cardozo was Roberts started out good, but he was allowed himself to be intimidated by Franklin Roosevelt during the court packing scheme thing. I would say his best was the Clark Memorandum, which basically repudiated the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine.
They were all pretty good, so kudos to that. Franklin Roosevelt. Obviously, FDR had so many big accomplishments, so it is really difficult for me to pick just one, but I guess I'll go with his signing of the Social Security Act, which created the Social Security program that so many Americans seem to take for granted today. Over time, it has led to a dramatic decline in poverty among the elderly. Overall, you can't deny his effective leadership during the Great Depression and World War II. He really did help us get through some dark times.
FDR's New Deal definitely changed Americans' relationship with their government. Really, before that, people didn't really expect aid from their government. But ever since the New Deal, people have come to expect it.
I would say his biggest accomplishment for Franklin Roosevelt is winning World War II. Also, creating a dependency upon the government is not a good thing. Once again, the other guy with him, everything this guy says, I think, is either just off base or silly.
Harry Truman. The Marshall Plan, for real. The Truman administration transferred more than $115 billion in today's money to European countries devastated by World War II. Its goals were not only to rebuild war-torn regions, but also to remove trade barriers, modernize industry, restore European prosperity, and prevent the spread of communism. And I'd argue it was one of the most effective programs ever implemented by the United States government in history.
Here's something to think about. The Marshall Plan really helped economically rebuild Germany and Japan. Now, if the Marshall Plan hadn't taken place, would we have had a World War III?
first off, the Marshall Plan, or basically outlining the Cold War, I would say would be the biggest accomplishment. There wasn't going to be a World War III because of the destruction of the atomic bomb. So unless Germany would have got someone in control crazier than Stalin, there wasn't going to be a World War III. So, like, once again, kind of a goofy comment by this other guy here. Yeah, Russia was the threat. Germany wasn't going to be built as strong as Russia. And without the Marshall Plan, Germany and Japan wouldn't have been as strong as they were anyway. That rebuilding made those countries stronger. So, yeah, there wasn't going to be a World War III. Really, Truman and Eisenhower are probably two of the presidents that should get the most credit for there not being one.
Dwight Eisenhower. I think Eisenhower's biggest accomplishment was his massive role in the creation of the interstate highway system. I got a whole video here about the interstate highway system. If you want to learn more, you can watch it later, but stick around. We have more presidents to learn about here. What? You didn't know there were other presidents after Eisenhower? Didn't your mother ever tell you about the other presidents after Eisenhower? John F. Kennedy.
Eisenhower's biggest accomplishment really was his Cold War leadership. At least 6 times all of his generals pretty much unanimously recommended going to nuclear war, and Eisenhower said no all 6 times. So he basically had 6 Cuban Missile Crisis level things happening in his presidency. He also got us out of the Korean War, was smart enough to stay out of Vietnam, though. Lyndon Johnson screwed that one up. So yeah, I'd say Eisenhower should be basically Cold War leadership. He gave solid core. So did Truman. That's kind of the same accomplishment for both of them. Although Truman, I can see you saying the Marshall Plan is part of that as an individual accomplishment. But Eisenhower pretty much is probably not blowing the world up because it probably would have happened with a different president. Only Eisenhower could have said no that many times to all of his generals.
Well, you could say avoiding World War III with his handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
That's exactly what I would pick for Kennedy. His handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He was smart enough, he was tough enough to not just back down, but he was smart enough not to let an actual war happen.
But I'll go with his civil rights efforts. Before his death, JFK proposed a huge civil rights bill that ultimately became the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
But this is the thing, too. He didn't accomplish that as president. That was accomplished by Lyndon Johnson, so it kind of goes against his rule. The Peace Corps, while noble, is not, that's the next thing he's saying. It's not on the level of the other things. I'd even say his, if you're not going to go Cuban Missile Crisis, I'd say either his defense of Berlin when he went over to Berlin was good, or maybe even his moon speech where he set out the agenda of going to the moon by the end of the decade.
And a shout out to the Peace Corps, which JFK established. It's a wonderful program that really helps so many people out. Lyndon Johnson. LBJ also got a lot done while he was president, especially with civil rights. But I'm going to go with him signing the Social Security Amendments of 1965.
I mean, how do you not say civil rights for Lyndon Johnson? I mean, if you're going to give it to Kennedy, Johnson did way more than Kennedy did. So, I mean, that one just doesn't make any sense. And otherwise, if you take out civil rights out of the equation, Kennedy was way, way, way better than Lyndon Johnson. If you don't count Vietnam against Johnson, Kennedy was way, way better than Lyndon Johnson. Especially without civil rights. I mean, civil rights, that's the thing Johnson has.
Which created both Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare is a health insurance program that provides cheap coverage for the elderly, while Medicare is a health insurance program that provides cheap coverage for those with lower income. Both programs have helped tens of millions of Americans have access to quality health care who otherwise would not have access.
One part that's missing here is that it actually raised the cost of health care. And before these programs, there were a lot of doctors that would actually do pro bono work for people who could not afford it. So it kind of got rid of that end of it. So did it really give health coverage to people that wouldn't have gotten it? It probably gave better coverage, especially to senior citizens. But the argument, plus part of it was part of the overall welfare system that Johnson made, is for people that were that got the Medicaid, that kind of trapped those people into those programs. Because if you make so much money, you lose your Medicaid, you lose your food stamps, you lose your check in the mail, you lose your other assistance programs. So basically, kind of holds people down in a way. I mean, that's actually been shown. That's why poverty rates really haven't dropped since Johnson left office, because his programs, and they were dropping steadily before he became president.
Programs have also led to healthcare innovation and increased medical standards.
That's another thing. It doesn't. That leads to healthcare innovation. Actually, is the private market. It's pretty much that's why most healthcare innovations are in the United States. Countries have programs like Medicare and Medicaid that are for everybody, but the innovations don't happen in the United States where there's private healthcare. So that's another falsehood. Not saying that he's lying on purpose, because he probably does believe that, but he's just mistaken.
Richard Nixon. Nixon's policy of détente, or a more flexible policy of negotiation to ease relations with both the Soviet Union and China during the Cold War, was brilliant.
It's only détente with the Soviet Union. It's called rapprochement with China. But he is correct that these two here, plus ending the Vietnam War, are probably his three biggest accomplishments. Détente and rapprochement had a lot to do with ending the Vietnam War, because then those countries put pressure on Vietnam to sign a peace agreement. There would have been no peace agreement without détente and rapprochement. That would not have happened unless the United States just said, we're done, and left. There would have never been a peace treaty, although North Vietnam basically just broke the treaty anyway.
I actually think it was the most effective thing any president had done up to that point to set the stage for the Cold War coming to an end.
I disagree with that. I'm not saying Nixon was a bad Cold War president, but Truman had to define the Cold War, and Eisenhower was I think Truman and Eisenhower were the two best Cold War presidents before Ronald Reagan come along. I'd put Reagan because he actually won the whole thing first. Then it'd be between Truman and Eisenhower. Then it would be Nixon fourth. That's all based on their Cold War leadership, not on other things they did. Just Cold War leadership.
So, did you know that all the moon landings happened when Nixon was in office? I always forget about that.
Now, whether you like the way it ended or not, it is notable that America's involvement in Vietnam ended under Nixon.
That's the only intelligent thing he says. Everything else he says is kind of goofy. Either it's a goofy thing he's saying for comedic purposes, or just really bad history or whatever.
True. Gerald Ford. How about the Privacy Act of 1974? Ford signed that. It's one of the few laws in American history that even attempts to protect the personal records of Americans from being exploited by the government.
Well, apparently they overrode that sucker later on down the road with the NSA scandal. But I'd say Gerald Ford pardoned Nixon and getting the country past Watergate and healing the nation was his biggest. I'd say healing the nation. And part of that was pardoning Nixon to heal the nation from Watergate. That was his biggest accomplishment. He healed the nation, gave an honest administration, a very competent administration, got some trust back in the government. So he deserves credit for that. So I think that's his biggest accomplishment.
Jimmy Carter. I'd say the biggest accomplishment of Carter while he was president is something usually attributed to his successor, Ronald Reagan, the deregulation of several industries. With Carter signing of the Airline Deregulation Act, the Motor Carrier Act, the Staggers Rail Act, and the Depository Institutions Deregulation and Monetary Control Act.
It is true that he did a lot of deregulation in the transportation industry. Carter added on more regulations elsewhere. In fact, the book of regulations doubled in size under Carter. I think it more than doubled, like the total number of regulations. Plus, he did the Department of Education, which added all kinds of new regulations in the education fields. And he did the Department of Energy, which added all kinds of new regulations there. So he did have some small deregulation. And I do agree that the little bit of deregulation he did was the best things he did. But overall, he was bad at regulations. So this is kind of a weird thing where you're giving him credit for something that the one good thing he did, but overall, he was bad in that area. And Reagan did more deregulation overall, or at least he held the line on regulations, while President Carter, regulations exploded under Carter.
He helped make markets become more competitive than arguably most presidents before him. Say what? Ronald Reagan.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Reagan's biggest accomplishment was convincing the world that the Soviet Union was a failed state, and he indeed was a big influence on the fall of the Soviet Union.
It wasn't him convincing the world that the Soviet Union was a failed state. He actually defeated the Soviet Union. He basically defeated them economically. So he destroyed them without firing a shot. That's his biggest accomplishment, winning the Cold War, because basically most people, especially from Kennedy through Carter, were of the thought process that we're just going to have to peacefully coexist with them. They're here to stay. And Reagan did a 180 on that and defeated them.
You can't deny that. His relationship with the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, was particularly an instrumental part of this. George H.W. Bush. Although you could say the Gulf War was quite a smashing success as far as wars go, I hate to say a war is his biggest accomplishment. So I'll go with Bush's signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990, which has led to dramatic improvements regarding access and accommodations to public services and facilities for those with disabilities. This is another law we greatly take for granted today.
I agree that those were both big accomplishments, but Bush's biggest accomplishment was really his handling of the end of the Cold War. He didn't do anything that would have caused the Soviet Union, or basically the hardliners within the Soviet Union, to kind of make things worse. He handled it perfectly. So I'd say the handling, those other two things are big, but the handling of the end of the Cold War is his number one accomplishment.
Bill Clinton. Well, let's keep the laws we take for granted today theme going here with the Family and Medical Leave Act of 1993. Bill Clinton signed that. Well, he did. It makes it so that employers have to provide employees with job-protected, unpaid leave for certain medical and family reasons. In other words, you can't get fired for taking time off to take care of your sick mother, for example.
Good act, but his number one accomplishment really was welfare reform. That was his number one accomplishment.
George W. Bush. As many mistakes as Bush Jr. made.
This is the thing, too. He says he's doing this as a historian, but this is his political beliefs bleeding into all this.
Throughout his presidency, I've never denied that he was a good leader. He was. So his biggest accomplishment? Keeping the country united, determined, focused, and even hopeful after the horrific 9/11 attacks. Sure, things went chaotic and divisive once he made the decision to invade Iraq, but before that, Bush's leadership regarding going after suspected terrorists around the world was phenomenal.
His leadership after September 11th was great. Most people at the time wanted to go to war with Iraq. There's actually a law passed under Bill Clinton that said we're going to change the regime in Iraq. So it was very popular. Most of the people in the Senate and the House voted for it. It was only when they were looking for something to go after Bush on that they went after him on Iraq. So it was popular when he did it. People thought it would be a cakewalk more than what it was, but all the terrorists just streamed into Iraq. But his leadership, not only his leadership after September 11th, but there was no major terrorist attacks on U.S. soil after during the rest of his term. So he did a pretty good job there.
Barack Obama. Obamacare, duh.
Obamacare, I say overall is bad. I will say that there's one really good part of Obamacare that I would say is his best accomplishment, which would be the part of the law, just this part, well, maybe two parts that you could go with, but the part of the law that allows people with pre-existing conditions to not be denied coverage. You could also argue that it's good to let people 26 and younger be able to buy onto their parents' coverage. But overall, I think Obamacare's bad. I'm going to let him continue with this Obamacare, though.
Obama spearheaded and signed the law, named after him, but also known as the Affordable Care Act, which dramatically increased the amount of Americans who had health insurance.
It increased it because basically it forced people to buy health insurance that otherwise wouldn't. I mean, if you basically put a gun to someone's head and tell them to do something, you do it with enough people, more people are going to do that. So that's not quite gun to the head, but if you didn't buy health care, they're going to charge you on your taxes enough that you might as well buy it anyway and have it because you're paying for it anyhow.
While the law was far from perfect, most Americans have appreciated it since it has made it so that health insurance is more affordable to
It actually is not more affordable. I was buying health insurance both before and after it passed, and health insurance costs went up quite a bit because of it. Health insurance is less affordable because of Obamacare, not more affordable. It's gone up quite a bit. It's actually been shown the increase in the cost of health insurance accelerated under Obamacare, so it's less affordable. It's more affordable if they're just going to hand it to you, but if you're someone that's middle class or even upper lower class, you're paying more.
lower income families and made it so that health insurance must cover them regardless of pre-existing conditions. I recently learned that there is some evidence that Obamacare has actually helped reduce healthcare costs overall.
I'd like to see that evidence. I wonder if he actually has it listed here. It doesn't actually. I don't know. Well, he did heritage, but yeah, for business injuries, merchandise. Yeah, it doesn't look like there's a lot of, but yeah, it's gone up. The thing with Mr. B was he was a teacher, so he got cheap, really good health care by being a teacher, so he wouldn't have noticed these increases. But the average people out in the workforce did notice the increase in cost. That's why nobody liked Obamacare.
Although the Heritage Foundation found the opposite to be true, so
yeah, so he's got two conflicting reports. So, and he kind of says, "Oh yeah, it's cheaper," but then he's like, "Oh, these guys should say something different." So, he's kind of once again showing his political affiliations here. That he's believing the side that says what he wants to hear, but not believing the other side.
I don't know. The Heritage Foundation, you love them, don't you?
Thanks, Obama.
Donald Trump. Trump's biggest accomplishment was his signing of the First Step Act, one of the biggest criminal justice reform laws in American history. It reformed federal prisons and reversed harsh sentencing laws and basically just made it less likely for folks to go to federal prison for stupid stuff.
I wonder what this, I would have to go really into that further, but I'd say his biggest accomplishment that most people just completely ignore is that ISIS was a major issue under Barack Obama, especially in the second term, and Trump pretty much crushed ISIS out. ISIS is gone now. Defeating ISIS, which was probably worse than the Taliban even, which was defeated under Bush for the most part. ISIS was a lot of former Taliban, was Trump's biggest accomplishment, honestly, whether you like him or not.
Joe Biden. Well, he's only been in office for a year and a half at this point, but I'd say his biggest accomplishment, at least so far, is bringing the troops home from Afghanistan. Now, how it went was obviously a disaster, but at least he had the courage to do it.
I don't think it was courageous to do it because most people wanted it to happen, and it was a disaster the way he did it. I'm not going to get into his accomplishments beyond that, but yeah, if that's the best you have, Mr. Beat, that's not very good. But being that he's the current president and he hasn't had a full term, he really shouldn't even be done here. But okay. This is the end of the video. Thanks for subscribing, like, share, comment, and have a great day. Bye.